Okay, today's date is 3 June 2023. My name's Dennis Gill. I'm here in the Reading World War II weekend, and I have the pleasure of sitting down with Rodney Putnam. Thank you, Rodney. Appreciate you sitting down and talking to us.
It's nice talking to you, sir.
Can you just give us a little bit of background on yourself? Where did you grow up? Where were you born? Go to school? Things like that.
I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, 1962. My dad was in the Air Force at the time, so about 8 weeks after I was born, I was on a plane to go to Germany.
Okay.
And my dad was stationed at the Rock in Hahn, so he spent 4 years there working as a comms person, and that's where I first got my indoctrination to the Air Force way of life, and the military, and being able to move around with family and friends and just enjoy all the different things that the Air Force had to offer at the time. We moved back to the U.S. and spent about 2 years in Altus, Oklahoma, and then my dad got orders to go back to Germany for the second time. So we went back to Germany. I got to visit. At that age, I was a little bit more, I guess you'd say, obviously I could remember things a lot more. So I can remember, going to these different wine fest and going to New Schweinstein and going to Italy and camping. So my dad found out that I actually had dyslexia, and I couldn't read until I was 9 years old. So they basically shipped us back to Dayton, Ohio, and enjoyed that. The Air Force Museum was right there, and my dad decided at that point, he had had 21 and a half years in, and he decided to get out of the service. So he returned back to North Carolina, and we went to Charlotte, and that's where our family was from. And mom and dad were still, had a lot of relatives around that area, and I went to different high schools. North Mecklenburg High School was where I graduated in 1982, and then I got out of high school and decided to go to work full-time at Lowe's. Well, 3 years later, I decided, well, that's not for me. There was a lot of pressure in sales in that, so I decided to join the military. And I went in the Air Force in February 1985, went to Lackland, did my training there, and went to Wichita Falls for my follow-on training. And then I selected as my first assignment was Spangdahlem Air Force Base in Germany. And I did my follow-on training before going to Spangdahlem at Seymour Johnson, working F4Es. So went to Spangdahlem. I enjoyed the time there. We would go down to Zaragoza for bombing every once in a while. I traveled the country in my car with a bunch of my other buddies. We visited all the places that were afforded to us at that time. Unfortunately, we couldn't. You had to get on the train to go to Berlin, but I worked F4s, E's, and G's there, and then I decided to come back to the States, and my assignment was originally supposed to be Mountain Home, Idaho, which I didn't want to go to Mountain Home because there's just no women behind the trees, a lot of open brush there. So I extended a year, and the next day my orders changed to Davis Monthan in Tucson, Arizona. So I went there, and they had OA-37 Dragonflies. They were deactivating those, and that's where the Air Force had its first forward air control FAC A-10s, OA-10s. And I worked on A-10s in a phased hangar. So they'd go in and tear the plane down. That's where I became qualified in multiple different disciplines, hydraulics, engines, and basic structure of the aircraft. That's where I first became engine run qualified to run the TF-34 engines on the A-10. And I enjoyed Tucson, got to go down to Nogales. We'd go up to Nellis every once in a while for a red flag. And I think in my Air Force career at that point, I felt that I kind of wanted to be closer to home. I'd been 2,000 miles one direction, and then I came back and I was looking at going 2,000 miles the opposite direction. So there was a shortage in the F-15 community for crew chiefs, and I volunteered, and I waited and I waited and I waited, and I got no orders. And then one day the Air Force Chief of Staff was there, and we were talking, and I was talking about, hadn't received my orders yet, and the following day my orders came in, and I ended up going to Mountain Home anyhow. The Air Force had decided to create the first composite wing up there, which had F-15s, the C models, the Strike Eagles, the F-16s, the KC-135s, and they had B-52s out of Barksdale that flew in as part of a composite wing. Now, the beauty of going to Mountain Home is, had I had never gone there, I would have never deployed to Operation Bright Star in Egypt. We spent 3 weeks there combined with the Army, flying with the Egyptians, and I can remember vividly visiting the pyramids at Giza. And then the best part about it was the Army was offering Black Hawk helicopter rides. So we got to get into Black Hawks, and we rode over top of the missile silo sites there, and then I got some awesome pictures of the pyramids from the air. So we enjoyed that. The Army would provide us with MREs in the day, and then we'd eat steak that was flown in by the 135s at night. So it was awesome. I also deployed to Alaska. So we spent 2 weeks up there. That afforded me a chance to, see all of our country as far as the beauty is concerned. That was one of the beauties of being in the Air Force. And if you chose to move around, you could see, vacation was at will. There's a lot of people that never go anywhere in life, and they stay within a certain circle. And I think I found myself blessed by God to be able to travel to different places. So I decided after 2 years of being up in Idaho, it was time to try to go to North Carolina again. So I actually volunteered to go to Iceland, and my dad came up, and I was still single at the time. We left, we went out into Oregon, and we started traveling around a long way back to North Carolina before I was to go overseas. And we stopped in Spokane at the B-52 base up there, and called back and talked to my mom, and she said, "I hope you're enjoying yourself, because the Air Force called up and your orders are canceled." So I was like, man, this is not good. I don't want to spend more time in Idaho. So I called and talked to my first sergeant. He called and talked to Manning Flight there, and they called me back a couple of hours later, and they like, "Where do you want to go in the U.S.?" And I said, "Well, I'd really love to go to North Carolina. That was my original plan." And they said, "Well, give us a little bit of time. We'll give you a call back." And then ended up going to Seymour Johnson, which is in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and joined the first training squadron of F-15 Strike Eagles there. And I spent 3 years there, and while I was there, traveling back and forth to see my parents in Charlotte, I met my wife. She was a teacher at a Christian academy there in Charlotte, and within 90 days we were engaged, and within 6 months we were married on the 28th of June, 1997. So we were at Seymour for about another year, and I knew, because I hadn't really made it to a remote yet, that I was hot for orders. So I asked her, I said, "You want me going to Korea for a year, or do you want to try to go overseas long?" So she goes, "Let's go overseas long." So I volunteered for Alaska, and I volunteered for Germany again, and I volunteered to go to England, and we got England. So I was stationed there for 4 years at 492nd Fighter Squadron. I worked F-15s there for a while, and then became an expediter, and then eventually ran the face dock for the 492nd there in England. Our son was born in RAF Lakenheath, so he's got dual citizenship, and we traveled everywhere in England Scotland that afforded itself to us. I think my incentive flight in England was probably one of the best that I've had while I was in the Air Force. I had a Lieutenant Colonel Purdy that was he used to fly for the Thunderbirds, and we went up in a two-ship, and he goes, well, you know that part in Top Gun where you get washed out by jet wash? We were sitting about 1.5 feet off the tail of the backside of the other Strike Eagle, and he says that's not necessarily true in a way. So, you know, flying in formation, he was an excellent Eagle driver, and during that flight we bounced down into Wells and flew through the mountains. Awesome, sitting in the back there, spinning up the paveway and just tracking things as you came at you. So we spent our 4 years in England, and then the last base I went back to was Langley. I was in the 94th Fighter Squadron there. We were supposed to be the first squadron to get the F-22s, but because the 27th was the oldest fighter squadron in the Air Force, they became the recipient of the F-22s and got that offer. So I worked as a flight chief for about 3 years there, and then started my indoctrination into the F-22s, and I got orders again finally to go to Korea, and I was like, I can't do this. I got a 4-year-old son and a wife. I don't need to go on a remote tour for a year. So I turned my orders down, and within 6 months of that, I was getting ready to get out of the Air Force, and I loved every minute of it. I retired in May of 2006. I'd never look back and say that there was anybody I ever met. It was a close community. It afforded travel opportunities. The pay wasn't the best, but that's not why you're in the Air Force, is it? You know, it's to serve your country. So I just thank the Lord for everything He's done for me and my family. That's pretty much the experience I had. One
of your jobs was to be a crew chief, correct?
Correct.
What does that entail?
Well, initially a crew chief entailed just working the structure of the aircraft itself. So, you know, you were responsible for inspecting panels, inspecting the engines, making sure the engines were, you know, had oil and fuel in them, dropping external tanks, and inspecting the ejection system, and obviously inside the cockpit to ensure there was no FOD, and it just entailed a lot of intricacies of that. When I was in, they changed it from basically just the structure itself when I was in Arizona to actually a full-blown working hydraulics. So I was able to cut lines out, put them back in, test the pneumatics in the system and the hydraulics, and then I also became qualified in pulling engines. The A-10's the first aircraft platform that I became engine run qualified as a senior airman, and I can vividly remember being out on the trim pad, and I had a pheasant land on the leading edge slat, and on the A-10, the monitor box to check all the electronics and how the engines and everything in the aircraft's operating is up there by the nose wheel well, and there's a person that stands up there by that, and I was on the comms with the gentleman, and I said, please don't turn around, because if you turn around, that bird's going to go right down the number 2 engine. And what's he do? Stand up, turn around, look at it, and the bird went right down the engine. So I was already borescope qualified, but that was an extra 2 hours worth of inspecting that engine just to make sure it wasn't FOD'd out. Chopped it up just like you'd piece out a piece of chicken. So high bypass fan, and so we same thing on the rest of the aircraft from that point forward. We pretty much qualified to drop engines on aircraft. I could drop an engine in probably an hour and a half on the F-15, and then do a bay inspection and have it back in within a 3-hour period. That was a lot of difference from the old days on the F-4, where you would drop the engine and you'd be there literally for days just writing up discrepancies to get things fixed.
Are you assigned an aircraft?
I was an assistant dedicated crew chief. 1684 was my first aircraft, and then 69255 was actually a G model Wild Weasel that was the commander's aircraft for the 52nd while I was stationed in Germany. So
You're also responsible for launching an airplane, correct?
that's correct. We would make sure, do a morning walk around, pre-flight inspection, and the pilots would come out. We'd pop them a salute, hand them the aircraft forms, walk through the forms with them, and the status of the aircraft. The pilots would do a normal walk around just to check, to see if they saw anything on the aircraft, their pre-flight check, and then we would have them started up, and we'd run through the flight controls with them, and then the aircraft would pursue down to EOR.
You have a favorite aircraft that you worked on?
As far as mechanically, as far as not being spending a lot of time, I would say the A-10 would be the friendliest aircraft I ever worked on, as far as maintenance was concerned. But as far as the Strike Eagle and the F-4G were both awesome aircraft to be on too. So.
You would deploy at some point in support of operations in Iraq.
Correct. So
both during the Gulf War and then, I guess what they call the second Gulf War,
right.
OIF.
Yep. So I was in Incirlik, Turkey. The first one I was at in Arizona at Davis Monthan, and the first Gulf War actually kicked off the day after I returned from North Carolina. I had gone to visit my family, and we deployed out and went to King Fahd Air Force Base. Unfortunately, the day I was getting ready to leave, my dad had arm pains in his left arm, and I told him, I said, have you been to your doctor? Because you're exhibiting signs of having a heart attack. So I flew back and got ready to deploy, and the day after I got there, my brother called me and told me that my dad had had a massive heart attack. So I had to fly back to North Carolina, and I was with him for about 3 weeks, and by the time I got ready to come back, the first Gulf War was pretty much a done deal. They had done everything they needed to make sure that Saddam would relent from his control of Kuwait and obviously not attack Saudi Arabia. The second Gulf War, I was actually deployed during Operation Northern Watch in Incirlik, Turkey. And the day the war kicked off was the day we stopped flying. Unfortunately, we flew out of there to make sure that the Kurds were protected, and that we took out radar sites that would have guided missiles towards our aircraft. And like I said, the day the war started, we were grounded. The Turks wouldn't let us fly out of there. Not only were we grounded, but they had the first infantry that was bunked with us at the same time. They were supposed to come in and be one of the prong attacks from the north, and they wouldn't allow them to go either. So we sat there for a month, just maintaining and keeping the jets ready in case we got the word to go. And then the Turks finally told us, you can leave now, and we did. So
were you flying? So during the first Gulf War, you weren't in Turkey for the first Gulf War, correct?
I was not during that time period. No.
When did you get to Turkey?
Actually,
to Incirlik, correct?
Yeah, Incirlik would have been when I went up to Idaho, so we would have been there probably in 94, 95, and then I would go to Seymour.
Operation Northern Watch, correct?
Correct, yeah. Operation Northern Watch.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then OIF, same deal, but that's when they told you can't fly.
Pretty much. We got to do everything we were supposed to. We would fly on certain days, and then the Turks would fly on certain days, and we all know what happened on those other odd days when the Turks were flying.
Yeah.
So I guess, as being part of NATO, and they had their agenda and we had ours. So
any moments stand out in your career?
Well, I think my retirement ceremony stands out most of all, because my dad had dementia, and I didn't realize he had dementia until I got ready to retire. So I kept asking my mom, is he going to be able to attend? And she kept giving me excuses as to why he couldn't come or why they couldn't come. And they finally relented, and they got there. And then that's when I realized my dad had dementia. And my mom had kind of been shielding the rest of the family from that. My dad had never received an awards box the entire time he was in the Air Force. So my oldest brother, who was in the Air Force at the time too, and my younger brother, we all got together, and I put together a shadow box for him. And the thing about my dad was he started off in the 82nd Airborne at Pope, and he was jumping out of planes with demolition strikes. He was a demolitions expert. But I think at a point he had decided that the Air Force was a better way of life, better quality of life, and he switched over. So he spent his first 3.5 years in the Army and the last 17.5 in the Air Force. So I have a box that I got put together for him, and I presented him, and I can reflect on being able to sit there and talk about stuff to him. And during the retirement ceremony, just looking at his face, and he was, unfortunately, the dementia had kind of taken over, so he wasn't really cognizant of what was going on during that time period. And unfortunately, about 1.5 years after that, I lost my dad to cancer. So he gave everything he could to this country, and my older brother was also in the Air Force, and he stayed in for 15 years and was in the Guard. But he blew his back out lugging batteries up to a concealed site in Korea. And after a couple years and 5 operations later, they discharged him from the Air Force too. And unfortunately, we lost him 2 years ago because he had pancreatic cancer. And this actual hat here was his hat. So I just kind of wear it in honor of him.
Let's go back real quick to Turkey. Your Northern Watch, what is the mission of Northern Watch? This is right after the Gulf War, the first Gulf War had kind of...
So the mission was kind of, from my understanding, was to protect the Kurds. And we would fly overwatch over, the northern part of Iraq to make sure that the Iraqis didn't bomb the Kurds. But unfortunately, we would fly on Monday and we would stand down on Tuesdays. And Tuesdays was the day that the Turks flew, and they were bombing the Kurds. So, in the military, sometimes things don't make quite sense, but you follow the orders that are given to you, and those were given by our commander-in-chief. And, I guess there was some sort of diplomacy there that we had to uphold on our end, and the Turks did what they did on their days. So,
what aircraft were you on at that point?
I was on the F-15 Strike Eagle. Yeah. So I worked F-4s, the E's and G's. I worked the A-10s. Then I graduated from those to the big boy planes again, and went back to work on F-15s, the C's, D's, and the Strike Eagles. And then got to see a lot of F-22s, but I didn't get to get my hands on any of those.
When you're in Turkey, what are the living conditions like?
We lived in tents. So you would have, at the time, the first time we were there, we were double bunked, during the first conflict. A lot of showers with, without curtains, your bare bones, you get your potted water there. We did have a chow hall there, so the base was fully manned for that. So it was nice to go to the chow hall. A lot of 12-hour shifts, 12 hours, 16-hour shifts. A lot of times trying to keep the aircraft, ready to go at any moment. But there was a lot of time to spend with other guys in your unit, and we'd have, sit out back and grill pretty much every day that we could, and a lot of time spent at the gym. And I think it afforded me a lot of time to study, because I was a tech sergeant when I went, and then I took the test shortly after that, and I found out I was promoted to master sergeant. So it afforded me a lot of time to just get back and reflect and spend time to get into the different manuals and the PFE and understand what the Air Force wanted, and to ensure, I knew what my career field intended for me to be.
Yeah.
So
aside from when the Turks were flying, how often, what was the tempo like? How often were you guys flying? Every day?
we were flying just about every day minus Tuesdays. So the days kind of blended together.
Yeah.
And when you put 12-hour days and then you're working hard and you're tired and you go back to the tent and you kind of just lay down, or you try to relax a bit, it just kind of becomes a blur. But you really lose control of the days, even though you've got calendars to kind of remind you of stuff like that. But everybody just kind of worked together, to make sure the mission was completed. So
you were in Incirlik how many times?
I was probably in Incirlik at least 5 times, 5 different deployments.
How would things change between the deployments as far as facilities go? And just
well, we went from being 2 people to a little tiny room. They finally got it down to, they still had both cots there, but it was about 1 person per room. And we still had the old MRE containers that you would turn into like shells, but that was during the first time around. And like the third and the fourth time, they actually had little tiny hutches in there so you could kind of set stuff up. I believe the last time I was there, they were getting ready to put in the modular units and make it a little bit more appealing, for people that were deployed there. But that was right prior to the last Gulf War, so I never went back after that. And that was back in probably 2005. Was my last deployment to Incirlik.
Were you always on worked F-15s when you were there? Or?
Yeah, 15s. So when I deployed, every time I went, we were F-15s, either C's or D's, and then the last probably 3 deployments were Strike Eagles.
Okay. What is the difference between those aircraft? C, D, Strike Eagle?
Well, the C is an air superiority. Carries MRAM 120s and AIM-9 missiles. The D model is just basically a 2-seater for training. It can carry the same complement of 4 120s, probably 2 AIM-9s and 4 AIM-7s. So that was pretty much the air-to-air role. And then the Strike Eagle had conformal tanks that were mounted to the sides of the vehicle. So basically that gave them the ability to put more than 600 gallons, because the conformal tanks were also fuel tanks, and also allowed them to load hard points for GBUs, Mark 82s, the AGM 130s that they used, and it also carried AIM-9s and then 120 missiles on it too. And then obviously the Strike Eagle had a paveway pod on the vehicle, so the EWO operator in the back could laser designate it, had a laser designation pod on it, so they could zoom in. I watched a video when we were there the last time, and they showed a guy sitting outside of a radar site. He walked out of that radar bunker and he struck up a cigarette, and that's about the last thing he probably ever did in his life. So
the Strike Eagle would be air to ground.
It's air to ground, and it has the yes, it's by far that's its main mission, but it has a capability for interceptions too. Because with the F-15Cs, you can punch all 3 bags off and go strictly air to air, and probably Mach 2 was the speed of the aircraft, but the Strike Eagle was more of a bunker buster, take out scuds, multi-role type mission there. So the conformal tanks were hung, and you couldn't jettison the conformal tanks.
Gotcha.
It's part of the aircraft.
During your time in Incirlik, was there any incidents that stand out? Anything exciting that happened?
Well, I can remember right before we had the second Gulf War, we would go downtown. You could go down and they'd have gold shops. You'd be able to go down there, and they would have they had a goat standing out in front of one of the restaurants there, and we walked past, and the guy invited us back later on, and he had butchered the goat, and that was the afternoon meal. So there were a lot of friendly people there. A lot of different things to pick up if you love leather, or if you love shotguns. Gold and silver were extremely cheap compared to the U.S., and they had a lot of unique things, puzzle boxes and rugs that they would sell. I think that's the best thing I remember about being in Incirlik. I had to fly back through a civilian flight while I was there due to a medical condition, and I can remember walking into the airport, the main airport there, and walking into a restroom, and you're looking at the stall with a hole in it. And that's the difference between third world country and being in the U.S. or any other country that's a little bit more, I guess, civilized, I guess you would say. It's not that they weren't civilized, but it was just their way of dealing with visiting the restroom, I guess you would say.
Right.
So
during your time there, you weren't married the first time you were in Incirlik,
No.
correct? But eventually you would be married.
Correct.
How were you able to communicate with family and stay in touch?
Basically, we would have calls, so you could call pretty much about once or twice a week, and you would long distance call. You would talk. My wife and my son, the last time I was there, I was afforded the opportunity to pretty much call almost at will. Anytime you'd go to the call center, if there wasn't anybody in line, you could call. And then obviously you took into consideration the time difference. So we kept pretty well apprised of each other, and email was an option. Later in my deployments there, so you could send emails back and forth. And I don't think they had Skype by that time. They may have, but we just basically used Audubon's, call back and forth.
Ever keep in touch with anybody that you served with?
I have members of my different units that I keep in touch with, either through Facebook, and I've actually have a good friend, Terry Pran, who I was with in Idaho. He was in the 390th with me, and then we met him and his wife with my wife when we were in Baltimore, and we were heading to Lakenheath. And he kept telling my wife, I can't believe you ever got married. This guy said he was, he thought I was never going to get married, but they were good friends. We traveled around with them a lot when we were in England, and we keep in touch with them. We went out. He's actually in Ohio right now, in Cincinnati, in that area, and I think a couple of years we went up there to see them. But I do keep in touch with some of the friends that I've had in the Air Force. I had a guy that was my roommate in Germany, and we're still, pretty good friends. He lives in California with his wife and daughters. Matter of fact, we went out west last year, and we went out to see them while we were out there. So that's the first time my wife got to meet. Well, she met Ed and Tammy. They came to my wedding, but they had, I think, at the time, a 1-year-old daughter, and their daughter had pretty much grown up, and she was in college the next time we saw her. So,
looking back on your experiences, how do you think that's affected or shaped who you are today?
I think it's made me a better person. It makes you willing to work with others. It makes you respect others. It makes you feel that you've had a hand in, protecting this country. And right, wrong, or indifferent, the circumstances we find ourselves in now, it's a shame that we seem to be having more people that are less likely to join the military, because there's not a sacrifice there that I think people tend to be more self-centered now. So People used to be able to work together and not against each other, and that seems to be that's the society we're in now.
So last question for you. We're going to preserve your story, and I don't know, maybe somebody in 100 years sees it. What advice would you give somebody, young man or woman?
I just say that you need to basically look towards your education. Your education could be through college. I found my education through the military. I mean, I told my wife I didn't want to go to college when I was younger, but I felt myself constantly being pushed to train on new things. And while I was in the Air Force, you know, I took college classes when I was there. So, you know, I would say to the younger group that they need to learn to get along together instead of being so divisive, to be against each other, you know. And color's nothing. I don't know why people worry about color. We're humans, right? We should all learn to get along together and not worry about the color of your skin. And regardless, I guess, of who's currently running the country, I wish that the young people would just figure out they need to probably put someone in there that's willing to help the country rather than to pull it apart for an agenda.
That's good advice. Well, on behalf of the Americans of Wartime Experience, thank you, sir, for sitting down and taking some time out of your day to tell your story.
Sure.
And thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Appreciate you too.